Good evening. So a little pause there at the beginning. So tonight I want to sort of blend my studio presentations with some political commentary and various just analysis and observations. It's something ultimately that I've been wanting to do with this channel. It just took a little while for me to set up my second cam and get it dialed in. So let's get through that stage. So this piece is called Her Totemic, and I'll leave a link down in the description below to a further explanation of sort of the technical side of how this piece was created. And I'll speak a little more when I switch back over, when I switch over to it. So this is it. This piece is about 8 or 9 inches tall, and it has been copper electroplated. So the toad with the matriarch archetypal face in its torso is solid pewter, and also the starfish. Starfish is from a mold, a direct mold that I made from an actual starfish. The headdress is original microcrystalline wax. The whole sculpture has been covered with aerosolized carbon, and since carbon is conductive, I was able to electroplate this entire original sculpture. So there is no mold for the sculpture itself. There's a mold for the toad, the face, and the starfish. But ultimately, this is one of one. The giant piece of rust I found out in the desert on my way back from Texas to California. Wish I had more of it. I wish I had more of it. That's pretty much it, and everything that wish implies. So, not a big story behind this piece, or even a small story. Ultimately, it was created out of simply a reverence for things that give off a sacred feeling or trigger something inexplicable in the mind or in the heart. The little coral growths coming off of it, that's from high amperage electroplating. So you get this effect if you crank up the amperage and you leave it in longer. So it's sort of a process-oriented experiment for those out there that are already into plating, which is a very small niche, even a micro niche, actually. You just have to experiment as far as how conductive the material that you're running your amperage through and how strong your copper sulfide mixture is. And there's a few variables, but ultimately the gist of it is that you get these coral growths through I would say 2 amps and above, and over a long period of time, like anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. Again, depending on your process. And so you have to keep kind of taking the piece out every once in a while and taking a look at it and gauging what's happening within that time period. The original, the patina is original. and it's been archivally sealed, so it is static. No more oxidation, no more environmental surprises for at least 100 years, because of course the archival seal will eventually, organic or not, it will eventually start to wear down. I feel like it turned out really well. I like the coral growths. That's why I cranked up the amperage, because I noticed these tiny little, almost flea-sized things growing on the ends, and it grows on the terminations because that's where the electricity is escaping from the piece. Curiously enough, it didn't grow on every termination of the starfish, so I'm not really sure what that's about. But ultimately, the diving board parts of the sculpture, that's where the coral reefs really went to town. And I like that. When I first found it, like I said, it was about the size of a flea, but I knew there was potential there. So I cranked up the amperage and left it in a long time, and got these extraordinary coral reef growths, and felt like it fell in line with the aesthetic of the piece. Ocean, toad, archaic sort of iconography, totemic vibes. And it gave it a more ancient feel, like maybe it's been in the ocean for 1,000 years and was discovered, and the archaeologists left the growths on it because they didn't want to destroy or harm the integrity of the sculpture that they've rooted into. So I'm going to hop up and turn this off, and then I'll be right back. So tonight I wanted to address a few things. This channel is ultimately dedicated to resisting propaganda, lies, coercion, dysfunction that could be addressed if mental health and ethics and morals were priorities in ultimately, I would say my focus is kind of on the Anglo-Saxon pathologies. I think every human being, every culture, every ethnicity has had their fascist come and go. And so it's a human situation. But in this day and age, it's the dysfunction seems to be statistically shared with the USA, the G7, Israel. I got some news today that since Israel is failing in Iran and Lebanon, they plan to go back to Gaza. Not that they've left Gaza, but they plan to go back and continue a more aggressive ethnic cleansing that, of course, they've been doing since October 8th of 2023. It's very disheartening to me that religion has ultimately failed. I mean, I guess it's a two-tiered situation. Maybe three if you consider what religion is without any worshipers, or any faithful. What would it mean just sitting in the vacuum of space with no context? So that's one layer, okay? And then another layer is the solitude worshiper, the solitary worshiper. One's personal take on it, and ultimately you create an existential bubble that is indifferent to organized religion, because you yourself, along with your creative process and intuitions, have created a kind of right of your own. And you can spell that RITE or RIGHT and still be right. It's your freedom to do so. And then there's organized religion, which does affect private individuals and how they interpret and whether even they approach it. So let's say organized religion group consensus has ultimately failed across the board. And I'm not so sure it's ever succeeded. When religion fails, to me, that pretty much negates the whole thing across the board. As an inspiration. Because for me, I have better things to do with my psyche and more successful ways to, quote, worship or admire the inexplicable and creation itself. Creation is much more sophisticated than the idea of a God. And if creation was a God, I'm not so sure how you'd worship it other than just simply being yourself and doing your best. Apologizing when you know it's necessary, and not apologizing when you know it's going to be just enabling another person's dysfunctional situation. So don't do anyone any favors. That's going to ultimately cost you a sense of guilt or disingenuousness inside yourself. And the reason I'm saying that organized religion has failed is ultimately the Pope could come out and whip up an anti-ethnic cleansing campaign against Israel. But he doesn't, because of the human side, that religion has to go through a lot of egoic human filters before it can be itself. And by the time it does that, it's not itself. Like, you can't tell anything by an actor by watching their movies as far as what kind of individual they are. You have no clue. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of theories and hypotheses and pontificate until the sun burns out, but you really never know unless you know them personally. Or maybe you watch interviews with them where their defenses are down and they're more, they're not guarded, let's say, and they're free to simply express who they are. And even then, when you're in the context of an interview, you're already prompted and pre-suggested to be a certain version of yourself for the interview. But it's certainly closer to the real self than, say, a movie. And I'm pulling up this metaphor because religion ultimately, statistically, displays itself as a movie. And the power that it could have as a moral and ethical boundary line is not used when things really hit the wall and it's needed. The support is needed. And I guess I'm more focused on around Christianity, Catholicism, Judaism. Some Judaism has come into play with the Jewish pro-Palestinian movement, who are anti-Zionism and they protest against Israel's version of what they call Judaism, which ultimately you can't be a Jewish Zionist. It's not possible. You can talk about it for hours and it's all nonsense, because ultimately Zionism is counterintuitive to Judaic law and Judaic principles. I mean, it's just plain and simple. Zionism is a secular, more political movement, nationalist movement, has much more to do with the persona and the ego than anything to do with humility and worship, or putting under one's own thumb certain vibes that arise that you have to wrestle with and resist. Well, religion may help with that on an individual level, but when it comes to wars and helping the innocent and the helpless, it can be an utter failure. If anything, it actually supports wars and creates wars. So there's a lot of dissonance going on at the core of religion as far as a mass consciousness phenomenon. So my relationship is definitely more of an agnostic situation, and nature and phenomenon. I may get into some things around that later as far as ancestral religion, like primordial religion. I feel like there's still something there that's unchangeable, that cannot be manipulated by the ego, because it's too close to nature. It's too dependent on what is versus what you believe is based on what someone else has said, or faith. There's processes and experiments and experiences that one can have in relation to primordial religion that do not rely on belief. It ultimately builds itself on personal experience. So I support, ultimately I support individuals around their pursuits. So in so long as it's not judgmental or out preaching that others need to be like itself, but just a humble, more sage-like or monk-like relationship to whatever you choose to consider your religious faith. I think that that's safe enough. Do no harm, including to yourself. But even those that do harm to themselves, I mean, that's also your right. And maybe it will teach you something. We have to experiment sometimes. And I don't mean this, like a masochistic way, like some kind of harm in that way, but I mean more emotional harm or getting yourself worked up into some sort of long ego trip journey. But if that's what it takes to bring you to another level or away from or into something else, then that's what it takes. But in my mind, I'm not speaking about that category. I'm speaking about the more public, organized version of that institution. And it has utterly failed Gaza and Lebanon and Iran because the ethnic cleansing is continuing across the board. And I think that the vassal states, the monarchies around Israel, they need to get smart really quick. Greater Israel has plans for Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Ultimately, they have plans for everybody because the implications are that if that project was to be fully initiated, the whole region would be under its effect. And personally, I don't think they have the numbers. I think the math just simply does not work out. If the whole place was desolate and Israel was the only populated piece of geography within 1,500 miles, okay. I mean, maybe it's going to work out, and whatever. You create your own problems. You sleep in your bed that you make, but they are not desolate in the sense of being surrounded by uninhabited lands. They are surrounded by tens of millions, and I think the highest population of Israel was around 8 million at some point. It's not that today. A lot of people are moving, and rightly so. But they simply don't have the numbers. And so it's a mind child left over from the early Zionists and the British colonizer pathology, psychosis, and it's also a symbolic ego trip of evangelical Christians and what they call Judaic Zionists. But again, there's no such thing as a Judaic Zionist. You simply cannot be Jewish and Zionist at the same time. It is it's the highest form of magical thinking that is just pure self-sabotage and a lie. And so it just goes to show you that the ego is much stronger than religion. It can manipulate almost anything. There's certain things it can't, like death. You know, it can't really get around that one. And certain hard truths, like you can't hold your breath forever. And there's some other experiences that it cannot hold back either, like illnesses and certain non-ordinary states of consciousness, both that could be self-initiated or simply come about during sleep, like dreaming. So it is vulnerable, for sure. So I just wanted to put that out there tonight, to share the sculpture as a bit of a reprieve, and share some things that are on my heart and mind. It's really sad to see Trump waffling around and panicking and then coming back and acting like a real man. And then there's things that he's written recently that I know he didn't write. There's no way that he would ever have that kind of control over the semantics of the English language. So he's having meltdowns on top of meltdowns, and he's just simply not capable of being an adult. And in the real world, outside of his role as president, however that happened, okay. I mean, there's no judgment there. Like, there's a lot of adults that cannot be adults. They look like adults, but you know, you can't control aging, and so just because you're old doesn't mean you're an adult, that you're mature, that you can handle certain triggers and certain and that you can handle your own imagination and interpretation of things that trigger you. I mean, these are all inner capabilities of both children, teenagers, and adults, and the tools and the mechanisms for all that take time to mature and practice and put into use. And if you don't do that, then you don't mature. You basically, your tools are as worn as you yourself have used them. There's no way around that. You can't give your tools to someone else and have them work 40 hours a week and then return the tools after 5 years and call you experienced, because the person who has done the work, there's no way to transfer that experience over to the owner of the tools that were loaned. So again, if mental health and intellectual development, character development were priorities, the top priorities in society, in humanity, we would have a very, very different world. Right now, everything is well, not everything. I don't mean to sound too fatalistic, but ultimately right now, materialism and just the day-to-day survival is ultimately the focus. And it's not to say that if certain priorities and certain activities were diminished and something more important came about and people recognized it as more important than the distractions, and those distractions were minimized and moderated, because as with children, you have to bring in moderation, otherwise they get spoiled. Adults get spoiled too, and that inhibits their emotional quotient's evolution. It inhibits their intellectual tool bag when distraction is much easier than determination. So we shall see. I mean, it's up to this point, it's mainly been just individuals modeling what I'm speaking about. They become heroes, legends, saints, and the like. But the what the mass society is advertised to do, and brought in to do, what they think is the status quo, that just simply needs to change, I feel. And because too much of a good thing becomes a disease. And I think we're seeing that in 2026, that when you have a swamp draining a swamp, what's the point? Well, oftentimes it's simply to drain a smaller pond, swamp into the larger one and just make itself bigger. And then saying, well, we did it. We drained the swamp. Never mind that we are the swamp, the larger one. So it's a bizarre situation. But you can trace the dysfunction of Trump and his presidency and all those around him all the way back to the founding fathers, and the legal chattel slavery, the mentality of the masses, the mass ethnic cleansing of the indigenous on this continent, all the class wars and civil unrest, the huge egos and early bankers and property developers and various mafia and gangs, and the list goes on and on. But this whole thing with Trump is simply a more transparent version of something that has been haunting the mass consciousness of America since its founding. It was definitely imported from England, and just grew and fostered a different version of the same thing here in the United States. So my condolences go out to the Lebanese, the Palestinians, the Iranians, the doctors, the ambulance drivers, the reporters, journalists that have been hunted down and erased from the face of the earth by Israel just for the sake of doing it. War crimes on top of war crimes. So my condolences go out to those families and their losses. Ultimately, to the living, and blessings to the deceased, that whatever journey you're on or whatever pause you're experiencing, may your footsteps be saturated with compassion, patience, depth of feeling, and good memories. And may your dreams come true. If not here, then another here. Good night.